Your Honor, that signature couldn't possibly be mine. I was having tea with the Queen of England that day. Well, not quite the Queen, but close enough. The look on Derek Sullivan's face when I said those words? Priceless doesn't even begin to cover it. His attorney dropped his fancy leather briefcase, and my daughter Jessica finally stopped looking at me like I was the villain in her love story. I'm Margaret Ashford, 74 years young, and I've been plotting this moment for 5 long years. 5 years of watching a snake slither through my family's garden, pretending to be a gardener. 5 years of being called paranoid, overprotective, and, my personal favorite, a bitter old widow who couldn't stand to see her daughter happy. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It warms this old heart to know where my words travel. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, the courtroom. Let me take you back to the beginning, because every good trap needs proper setting. And I've been laying this one since the day Derek Sullivan walked into Morrison & Blake Financial Services with his $100 haircut and his predatory smile. It was a Tuesday morning in April, 5 years ago. I was working my part-time bookkeeping job, something to keep my mind sharp after Henry passed, when Derek breezed through our office doors like he owned the place. He was 35 then, all polished shoes and calculated charm, claiming he needed consultation on wealth preservation strategies for blended families. Red flags? They were practically doing the can-can, but my colleague, sweet Diane, was instantly mesmerized. Oh, Margaret, isn't he lovely? So concerned about protecting his future family's interests, she actually giggled. Diane was 58 years old and giggling like a schoolgirl. I watched him work the room during our consultation. The way he asked questions wasn't curious, it was surgical. He wanted to know about trust structures, yes, but more importantly, about the loopholes. About power of attorney protocols. About how much documentation was required to access elderly clients' accounts. You seem particularly interested in protective measures against family exploitation, I observed, keeping my voice honey-sweet. His smile never faltered. I've seen too many families torn apart by financial disputes, Mrs. Ashford. I believe in being prepared. Prepared to exploit them, more like. After that meeting, Derek started his coincidental encounters. The coffee shop where I bought my morning latte. The library where I volunteered on Thursdays. The community garden where I grew my roses. Each time with a new story about how small the world was, how fate seemed to be throwing us together. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. I understand you have a daughter. Single mother, I believe? How wonderful that she has such a dedicated mother to help support her. I'd never mentioned Jessica to him. Not once. That's when I knew Derek Sullivan hadn't just wandered into our office by accident. He'd researched me, studied me, and now he was circling my family like a shark who'd smelled blood in the water. Jessica was 35, working herself to exhaustion as an emergency room nurse while raising my 2 grandchildren alone. 10-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Marcus barely saw their father after he traded his family for a 24-year-old dental hygienist. When Derek started volunteering at the community recreation center where Jessica brought the kids for their after-school programs, I knew exactly what he was doing. And I was powerless to stop it. Within 3 months, he was carpooling with my daughter. Within 6 months, he was helping Sophie with her math homework and teaching Marcus to throw a football. Within 8 months, Jessica was looking at him like he'd hung the moon personally just for her. "Mom, I know you're skeptical," Jessica said during one particularly tense conversation. But Derek is different. He's stable, he's great with the kids, and he actually wants to be part of our family. Jessica, sweetheart, don't you think it's odd that a successful financial consultant suddenly has time to volunteer at a recreation center? Don't you wonder why he's so interested in our family dynamics? Oh my God, Mom, not everyone is out to get us. Maybe, just maybe, Derek is simply a good man who's looking for a meaningful relationship. Why can't you just be happy for me? Because I'd been balancing books and spotting fraud for 40 years, and I knew a con when I saw one. But try telling that to a daughter in love. The first time Derek came to my house for Sunday dinner, I made my famous pot roast, Henry's favorite. Derek complimented everything from my cooking to my garden, played board games with Sophie and Marcus, and even helped with the dishes. And then he excused himself to use the bathroom. except the bathroom is down the hall to the left, and I watched Derek turn right, straight into my home office. I gave him exactly 90 seconds before I followed. When I opened the door, he was photographing my investment statements with his phone, casual as you please. "Looking for something, Derek?" I asked, my voice pleasant as Sunday morning church bells. He jumped like I'd caught him with his hand in the collection plate. "Margaret, your office is so well organized. I was admiring your filing system. How thoughtful." "The bathroom is the other direction, dear." That night, after Derek drove Jessica and the children home, I sat in that same office and made a phone call that would change everything. "Gregory," I said to my attorney, "I need you to build me a fortress." Gregory Mitchell had been handling my legal affairs since Henry's death. He was thorough, skeptical, and most importantly, he trusted my instincts. "Margaret, what are we protecting against?" "A con artist. He's after my family's assets, and I need to make sure that when he makes his move, he destroys himself in the process." Over the next 3 weeks, Gregory constructed a labyrinth of legal protections that would make Fort Knox look casual. Irrevocable trusts, multiple verification requirements, fraud triggers that would automatically freeze accounts and notify authorities if anyone attempted unauthorized access. Most importantly, every single change to power of attorney or financial documents required in-person verification with multiple forms of identification, witnessed by both Gregory and my bank manager of 20 years. "Margaret, this is extensive," Gregory said when we finished. "Any attempt to forge your signature or modify these documents will immediately trigger criminal fraud investigations." "Perfect. Because I have a feeling we're going to need every protection we can get." 3 months later, Jessica announced her engagement to Derek Sullivan. The wedding was beautiful, I'll give Derek that. He spared no expense. The flowers alone probably cost more than Jessica made in 2 months. When I asked how a financial consultant could afford such extravagance, Jessica accused me of trying to ruin her happiness. I smiled through the ceremony, danced at the reception, and went home to start a detailed file documenting every suspicious behavior, every financial inconsistency, every red flag that Derek raised. Because I knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. For the first 3 years of Jessica and Derek's marriage, I almost convinced myself I'd been wrong. He seemed devoted to Jessica, treated Sophie and Marcus like his own children, and maintained steady employment at a legitimate investment firm. Almost convinced myself, but leopards don't change their spots. They just learn to hide them better. The mask started slipping during Christmas dinner in year 4. Jessica had invited me over for what she called a family financial discussion, though her tone suggested it was more of an intervention. Derek sat at the head of their dining table with a folder of documents spread before him like battle plans. "Margaret, we've been discussing your financial situation, and we're concerned that you might benefit from professional management of your portfolio." There it was. 4 years of playing the perfect son-in-law, and Derek was finally making his move. "How thoughtful," I said, sipping my eggnog. "What exactly would this management involve?" "Well, for starters, consolidating your accounts into a single firm where I have professional relationships that could benefit you significantly. We could also modernize those trust structures Gregory created. They're unnecessarily complicated for today's financial landscape." Unnecessarily complicated. "Also known as fraud-resistant. That's quite generous," I replied. "But I'm curious, Derek. How do you know so much about my portfolio? I don't recall sharing specific financial details with anyone." The silence that followed was delicious. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Derek's smile tightened like a mask that no longer fit properly. "I may have mentioned some things," Jessica said weakly. When Derek offered to help review what, specifically? I interrupted gently. "I don't recall asking for help with my finances." That night, I went home and called Gregory to add additional security measures. Then I did something I'd never imagined doing in my 70 years. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Sandra Chen, and she came highly recommended by Gregory's law firm. Former FBI, specializing in financial fraud and identity theft. "What exactly are you looking for, Mrs. Ashford?" Sandra asked during our first meeting. "The truth about Derek Sullivan. I need facts, not suspicions." Sandra's preliminary report arrived 12 days later, and it was worse than even my paranoid imagination had conjured. Derek Sullivan wasn't just a gold digger. He was a professional predator with a documented pattern spanning a decade. His employment history was a masterpiece of deception. Short-term positions at various firms, usually ending when supervisors discovered discrepancies in client account handling. But his relationship history was the truly chilling part. Sandra had found 3 previous serious relationships with single mothers who had family assets. All 3 had ended with the women reporting identity theft, forged documents, and drained accounts. The first victim, Margaret Chen, no relation to Sandra, ironically, had lost $62,000 to identity theft that occurred 2 weeks after giving Derek a key to her apartment. The second victim, Patricia Hamilton, had discovered Derek had been using her personal information to apply for credit cards and loans. By the time she caught on, she was $84,000 in debt she'd never incurred. The third victim, Linda Morrison, had nearly lost her house when Derek forged her signature on a reverse mortgage application. "Mrs. Ashford," Sandra said when we met to discuss her findings, "this man follows a precise pattern. He targets women with children and assets, builds long-term relationships to establish trust, then gradually gains access to financial information before executing fraud. The fact that he's been married to your daughter for 4 years suggests she's his biggest target yet." I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at Sandra's report and feeling physically ill. Not because I'd been wrong about Derek, but because I'd been so terribly right. The next morning, I made a decision that would define the next year of my life. Instead of confronting Derek or trying to convince Jessica, who would never believe me, I was going to let him make his move while ensuring he'd walk straight into a legal trap that would destroy him completely. "Gregory," I told my attorney, "I want you to prepare additional fraud prevention measures that will be triggered the moment Derek attempts any unauthorized access to my accounts. And I want every attempt documented for criminal prosecution. Margaret, you're essentially setting up a sting operation. Yes, I am." 6 months later, Sandra called with news that made my blood run cold and my heart sing simultaneously. "Margaret, Derek's been making inquiries about your financial accounts, using Jessica's name and relationship to try to obtain information from your bank and investment firm. He's getting ready to make his move." "Good," I said. "Let him." The hardest part of the next few months was watching Jessica defend Derek while I knew what was coming. She thought I was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand her happiness. She had no idea I was protecting her from a predator who'd already destroyed 3 other families. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was 5:47 a.m. when my phone rang. Jessica's voice was shaking, but not with fear, with fury. "Mom, I need you and Gregory here now. I found something, and I think you were right about everything." When Gregory and I arrived at Jessica's house an hour later, we found her sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, looking like she'd been awake all night. But there was something in her expression I hadn't seen in years. The fierce determination she'd inherited from me. "He's been lying about everything," Jessica said without preamble. "Fake employment records, false references, stolen identities. I found bank statements showing deposits that don't match any legitimate income. And I found forged power of attorney documents in his desk, dated from last week when you were visiting Aunt Carolyn in Scotland." Gregory examined the forged documents with professional interest. "These are sophisticated forgeries, but they have several critical flaws that would make them worthless in court. More importantly, attempting to use forged documents to access someone else's financial accounts is multiple felonies." I called Sandra, who arrived with copies of her investigative report. We spread everything across Jessica's dining room table like evidence at a trial. "Mom," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face, "those other women. I defended him to you. I told you that you were being paranoid and bitter. I'm so sorry. You wanted to believe in love," I said gently. "There's nothing wrong with that. The problem was that Derek was never offering love honestly. That afternoon, the 3 of us, a grandmother who'd spent 5 years building a trap, a daughter who'd finally seen through a master manipulator's lies, and an attorney with enough evidence to put a career criminal behind bars, walked into the police station together. Detective James Carter took our statement and said it was one of the most well-documented fraud cases he'd seen in 20 years. "Mrs. Ashford, your financial protections prevented any actual loss. but the attempted fraud is more than enough for serious criminal charges. Combined with the evidence of previous victims, we're looking at multiple felonies across state lines. Derek walked into his house that evening expecting domestic bliss. Instead, he found 4 adults sitting in his living room like a tribunal: me, Jessica, Gregory, and Detective Carter. The look on his face was absolutely priceless. Pure panic, followed by rapid mental calculation as he tried to figure out which lie to tell first. "Jessica, honey, what's going on?" he said, setting down his briefcase carefully. "Why does everyone look so serious?" "Derek Sullivan," I said, my voice sweet as honey but sharp as steel. Or should I say Derek Patterson? It's getting hard to keep track of which identity you're using to commit fraud this week. Jessica stood up, and I'd never been prouder. "Don't even think about lying to me anymore, Derek. I know about the forged documents. I know about Margaret Chen, Patricia Hamilton, and Linda Morrison. And I know about what you tried to do to my mother." Derek's charming facade cracked completely. The warm smile disappeared, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with here, Jessica. Your mother is a paranoid old woman who's been sabotaging our marriage from day one because she can't stand seeing you happy." "Excuse me?" I said, standing up to face him directly. "I'm paranoid? That's rich coming from a man who's been photographing my financial documents and forging my signature to steal my life savings. That's not... These are all misunderstandings, paperwork errors." "Derek," Gregory interrupted, holding up the forged power of attorney documents. "These aren't paperwork errors. These are felony forgeries with clear intent to defraud a senior citizen. And Margaret was in Edinburgh when you allegedly witnessed her signing these documents. We have passport stamps, hotel receipts, and restaurant bills proving she was 4,000 miles away from your supposed notary appointment." The reality of his situation finally seemed to penetrate. Derek looked around the room like a trapped animal, calculating escape routes and finding none. "This is all circumstantial. You can't prove criminal intent from some disputed signatures." Sandra spoke up from her position near the door. "Actually, your signature patterns are remarkably consistent across multiple fraud attempts. I've been in touch with your previous victims. They're all very interested in pressing charges for what you did to them as well." Derek's last shred of composure snapped. Those women knew exactly what they were getting into. They were willing participants in everything that happened. The admission hung in the air like a confession written in neon lights. Detective Carter stood up. "Derek Sullivan, you're under arrest for attempted fraud, identity theft, forgery, and elder financial abuse. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Derek's wrists, he looked at me with pure hatred. After 5 years of successful manipulation, he still couldn't understand how his foolproof con had turned into a multi-state prosecution with cooperative victims building cases against him. "See you in court, Derek," I said sweetly as Detective Carter led him away. The weeks leading up to Derek's trial were like watching dominoes fall in a carefully arranged pattern. Detective Carter called regularly with updates that made me grateful for every suspicious precaution I'd taken. The investigation had expanded to include fraud cases in Illinois, Kentucky, Arizona, and Florida. Derek's methods were remarkably consistent across all victims. Identify vulnerable women with assets, build romantic relationships over months or years, gain access to financial information, then execute identity theft and fraud before disappearing with their savings. "Mrs. Ashford," Detective Carter explained, "we found evidence of 11 separate victims spanning 14 years. The total estimated theft is over $530,000. 11 women. 11 families destroyed. 11 lives turned upside down by one man's calculated greed." The preliminary hearing was on a Thursday morning in October. Jessica and I arrived at the courthouse to find an impressive gathering of Derek's victims, women ranging in age from 34 to 78, all with the same expression of determined justice I'd been wearing for years. Margaret Chen was a graceful woman in her 60s who'd used her retirement to help other seniors avoid financial scams. "Mrs. Ashford," she said when we were introduced, "I want to thank you for finally catching this predator. I knew he was a thief, but I never imagined the scope of what he was doing." Patricia Hamilton had brought her adult son for support. "That man didn't just steal money from me," she said simply. He stole my ability to trust people. I'm here to make sure he pays for every family he's destroyed." Looking around at this gathering of women Derek had underestimated, I felt fierce pride in our collective strength. He'd targeted us thinking we were easy marks, isolated women who would be too embarrassed or confused to fight back effectively. Instead, he'd created an army of highly motivated prosecutors who'd spent years documenting his crimes and building ironclad cases against him. Derek's preliminary hearing lasted 26 minutes. His court-appointed attorney entered a plea of not guilty to all charges, but the judge set bail high enough that Derek's face went white when he heard the amount. As he was led back to his cell, he caught sight of our group sitting in the gallery. The look he gave us was pure hatred mixed with disbelief. "See you at trial, Derek," I called out sweetly as the bailiff escorted him away. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Detective Carter called with news that was both satisfying and slightly disappointing. The prosecution has built such a comprehensive case that Derek's attorney is trying to negotiate a plea agreement. 28 years in state prison, full restitution to all victims, and permanent prohibitions against employment in any position involving financial responsibility or access to others' personal information. Jessica and I discussed the plea offer extensively. Part of me wanted the satisfaction of watching Derek face a jury and hear every detail of his crimes read aloud in court. But the practical part of me recognized that a guaranteed 28-year sentence would protect other potential victims while ensuring he spent the most productive years of his remaining life in prison. "I think we should accept the plea," Jessica said finally. "I don't need to hear him make excuses or watch him try to manipulate a jury. I just want him gone from our lives permanently." The plea hearing was scheduled for a gray Monday morning in November. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who'd finally realized that his charm and manipulation skills were worthless against documented evidence and cooperative victims. When the judge asked if he understood the charges and consequences, Derek's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you admit guilt to the charges of grand larceny, identity theft, elder fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across multiple jurisdictions?" Derek glanced back at our group sitting in the gallery. His expression was a mixture of defeat and lingering resentment. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's sentencing was swift and comprehensive. 28 years in state prison, restitution of $537,000 to his victims, lifetime restrictions on financial employment or access to other people's personal information. As the bailiff led Derek away in shackles, he didn't look back at us again. His career as a professional predator was finally over, and he would spend the next 3 decades learning what it felt like to be powerless in an environment where charm and manipulation were useless currencies. 6 months after Derek's sentencing, I received a letter that brought unexpected closure to our 5-year ordeal. It came from Margaret Chen, Derek's first victim, and it contained news that made all my years of suspicious preparation feel like divine providence. "Dear Margaret, I wanted you to know that the restitution fund has been distributed to all of Derek's victims. Thanks to your civil lawsuit and the asset recovery efforts, every woman he stole from has received full compensation for their losses, plus additional damages for emotional distress." Margaret went on to explain that she'd used her experience to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating adults about financial fraud and romance scams. "Derek taught us all painful lessons about trust and vulnerability," she wrote, "but we've turned those lessons into tools for protecting other families from predators like him." Jessica and I were invited to the organization's first annual conference, where fraud survivors shared their stories and law enforcement officials provided education about recognizing and preventing financial exploitation. Standing in that room full of strong women who'd refused to let one man's cruelty define their futures, I felt profound pride in what we'd accomplished together. "Mom," Jessica said as we listened to Patricia Hamilton speak about her advocacy work, "I've been thinking about what Derek said in court, that there are others like him and we'll never see them coming. What about it?" "I think he's wrong. We've all learned to see the signs now. We know what to look for, how to protect ourselves, and most importantly, we know we're worth protecting." The conference organizers had asked me to speak about financial protection strategies for older adults. Standing at that podium, Looking out at an audience of survivors and their families, I felt the weight of our collective experience and the power of shared knowledge. 5 years ago, I began, I thought I was just being a paranoid grandmother when I built legal protections against a son-in-law I didn't trust. Today, I know I was acting on instincts that had been developed over decades of watching people and recognizing patterns that didn't make sense. I talked about the importance of trusting those instincts even when family members dismiss concerns as paranoia or negativity. I shared practical strategies for protecting assets and personal information, and I emphasized that no one should ever feel guilty for being cautious about financial security. Derek Sullivan taught our families a valuable lesson, I concluded. He taught us that predators rely on our politeness, our desire to trust, and our reluctance to seem suspicious. But he also taught us that careful preparation and refusing to be victimized can turn the tables on even the most sophisticated con artist. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the promise I'd made to my late husband Henry 5 years earlier to protect our family from the predator who'd married our daughter. Henry would have been proud to know that our granddaughters Sophie and Marcus had watched their grandmother fight back against injustice, and that Jessica had found the strength to recognize and escape from manipulation. The house felt peaceful that night in a way it hadn't since Derek first walked into our lives. My financial protections were still in place, but they no longer felt like fortress walls against unknown threats. They felt like reasonable precautions taken by a woman who'd learned to value her own security and the safety of the people she loved. Derek is serving the 5th year of his 28-year sentence now. According to prison records, he's not adjusting well to an environment where manipulation and charm have no currency. The other inmates apparently have little patience for men who prey on elderly women and single mothers. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but when it finally arrives, it's worth the wait. Jessica is thriving. She's been promoted to head nurse in her emergency department, and she's started dating a genuinely kind man who treats her like she deserves. Sophie is in high school now, planning to study law. Marcus wants to be a detective like James Carter, and me? I'm 74 years old, living in the house Henry and I built together, surrounded by my roses and my meticulously organized financial records. I volunteer at Margaret Chen's nonprofit 3 days a week, teaching other seniors how to recognize and protect themselves from financial predators. People sometimes ask me if I regret the 5 years I spent investigating Derek, building my case, setting my trap. They ask if I feel guilty for not trusting him from the start, for being suspicious when everyone else saw only charm and kindness. My answer is always the same: I regret nothing. Because protecting the people you love isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. And sometimes the best revenge isn't just protecting yourself. It's making sure the predator never gets the chance to hurt anyone else again. I raised my evening tea in a quiet toast to the woman I've become, to the choices that protected my family, and to the knowledge that some grandmothers are far more dangerous than they appear to innocent eyes. Or in my case, to predatory ones. Before I close, I want to thank you for staying with me through this whole story. It's been therapeutic to share it, honestly. If you learned something from my experience, or if you have your own story about recognizing and stopping a predator, please share it in the comments. We protect each other by sharing knowledge. And remember, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone make you feel paranoid for protecting what's yours. This old silver fox is signing off now. Stay sharp, stay safe, and never underestimate what a grandmother can do when her family is threatened. Margaret Ashford. Author's note: this story is dedicated to all the grandmothers, mothers, and women who trusted their instincts when everyone else told them they were being paranoid. You were right. Keep protecting your families, keep trusting yourself, and keep being dangerous to those who underestimate you.